Hi, everyone. Welcome to this book discussion on global feminist autoethnographies during COVID-19, Displacements and Disruptions, edited by Melanie Heath, Akosua K, Darkwah, Josephine Beoku-Betts, and Bandana Purkayastha. The book was published by Routledge in 2022. We have two of the editors with us today and also one of the co-authors and our dear co-founder. Just to briefly introduce them, Bandana Purkayastha is a professor of sociology and Asian and Asian American studies and currently associate dean of social sciences at the University of Connecticut. The recipient of multiple awards and recognition, including the Jesse Bernard Award from the American Sociological Association. She is an elected member of International Sociological Association's Executive Committee. Melanie Heath is Associate Dean of Graduate Students and Associate Professor of Sociology at McMaster University. She studies the politics of family, sexuality, and gender, and is the president of RC32, Women, Gender, and Society, International Sociological Association, and co-president-elect of Sociologists for Women in Society. Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri has retired from the Center for the Study of Social Systems, CSSS, Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, New Delhi. Her research interests have been on the making of the public discourse in modern India. Her early work focused on nationalism, colonialism, and feminism in India. Since the early 1990s, she has been looking at the changing nature of public discourse in the context of both neoliberalism and the rise of majoritarianism. She is also one of the co-founders of Doing Sociology. We welcome all of you to this discussion. So let me begin by asking both the editors about how the edited book came into being. What was the main motivation behind bringing out this volume?
So I will start, and then hopefully Melanie can, fill in some of the details. This book came about somewhat organically. We were in the midst of COVID. There were all these massive transformations taking place in our workplaces to begin with, and also obviously in our lives. And the way I remember it is Josephine Beoku-Betts, who was the president of Sociologists for Women in Society, at that time also started initiating a number of programs so that the members of SWS, as I will call it from now on, so the members of SWS actually could find some support systems remotely. And the three of us initially, Melanie, Josie, and I, and then, Akosua, Darkwah joined in the conversation. We were talking about COVID, what was happening in our lives. And we thought, well, we need to document this. And so from that idea, it was a matter of, thinking of who else we had conversations with. And that's where Maitrayee comes in. I remember a fascinating conversation with her. And so each of us, that is the editors, we started reaching out to people we knew with whom we had conversations, or because we simply felt that they would be wonderful people to give us some views of what was going on. And we made a decision that we would only focus on academics, and I can discuss that later. But I think that was the start. We were all suffering, obviously to different degrees, because we have different kinds of privileges and lack of privileges. And for me personally, I know it also became a kind of support system. All the conversations about the books with people I respect, it acted as a way to get beyond the immediate what was happening during those years. So I'll stop there. I don't know, Melanie, if you want to add something to that.
I would just say that, that's I do think it grew very organically. I mean, one of the exciting things for me was being able to work with people across the globe. My role as RC32 president, the Women, Gender, and Society, I was able to contact members and, just really establish more connections with many of the authors. And so that also was a real benefit during a time that was so isolating, and where we were so far apart. So that in many ways brought us together.
Right. So sort of to take the conversation forward, I would like to go back to the title of the book, which is, where you use terms like disruptions and displacements, and even stress on distresses in the book to understand what happened to people's everyday lives. And we were quite struck by the fact that you avoid using the word trauma and instead use the phrase continuum of distress to trauma. Could you please elaborate on this? Dr. Heath, if we could begin with you and then
Sure.
Professor Purkayastha.
Okay, that sounds good. So when we were gathering all these stories, we felt like there were these three dominant themes, really, as we talked about what came out of people's experiences, and really disruptions, displacement, and distresses. We felt like that really captured the moment, that captured the time, it captured the feeling. Disruptions, the authors discussed, these global ways that their lives had been transformed for many in terms of blending and merging together of work and home life that had, in many ways, really negative impacts for many in terms of their mental health, in terms of their ability to get their work done, in terms of their academic lives. That COVID had this transformational effect that completely upended everything. And I would say that one of the important elements was that the kinds of distress that people experienced was really, of course, situational. It was, but also specific to positionality. And so, many academics are very privileged and have privileges that help to buffer in some ways some of the worst aspects of COVID. But then there are so many different ways that people are involved in academia. And so very precarious, students who had to still work, as essential workers, people who don't have tenured or tenure-track positions, and even people in tenure-track positions who are made more vulnerable because their departments are using these kinds of, using COVID and the pandemic as a way to institutionalize certain kinds of neoliberal projects and shrink their budgets and, get rid of people. And so, so this idea of this disruption, we also thought about the ways that displacements then are very important to how many people were experiencing this. And displacement, we thought of in terms of migration scholarship that really talks about how people who are forced to experience relocations, experience time, place disturbances that really transform their lives. And, we thought about this and we thought, well, of course, what refugees, for example, experience is so much more severe than anything than our authors are really experiencing, but there's some interesting parallels there where so many of the elements are out of control, and that the people that that were writing our stories we're talking about the kinds of isolation and inability to care for loved ones, the ways that movement became impossible, the kinds of restrictions that they felt. Some of them talked about health issues that weren't even related to COVID, but they couldn't get medical care that they needed. The restricted, the ways that people around them were dying, family members not being able to be there and participate in services for family members. All of these things, I think, bring together this idea of the distress, of the displacement, the disruption, And I would say, yes, many of this was traumatic. And so your question about, thinking through the trauma of this, we wanted to be careful in using that word because trauma, of course, is a word that really represents collective pain in many ways. And we didn't want it to be overused and overgeneralized in the sense that, there's so many things happening in the world that really represent extreme trauma, and the ways that intersecting kind of structures and the ultimate systems that allow for this suffering, it's important to be able to identify that and talk about the different ways that people experience individual types of disruptions and distress versus this trauma that we could think about in terms of the racial politics that have been taking place across the globe, but that were really sort of, during COVID, very much focused in the United States around the killing of many Black people by police, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, these kinds of layers of trauma and suffering, including the violence, the increased violence that many women and non-binary people or others, even men, were experiencing in their home as they were locked down, right? These increases in violence were so important. So I would say that, overall, these themes really wove together in a beautiful way to sort of highlight the stories that were coming together, and that we were really so grateful to all the authors for sharing these really difficult experiences that really reflect on the different positionalities of people. We'll be talking about that more later, of course, but also just the deep pain that people were feeling, the deep distress, the deep displacement, the ways that individuals had to negotiate the kinds of structures that COVID, sort of forced on all of us. Bandana, do you have something more you'd like to say?
Well, I think you've said, basically explained the essence of what we did. I want to just flag one other thing briefly. So in the US, George Floyd was killed at that time, which amplified the Black Lives Matter movement, which had been going on for a long time. But because we had a president who was characterizing the pandemic as a Chinese flu, the people who look Chinese, and I wish to emphasize look Chinese, which includes a lot of people from very different parts of the world, including, by the way, Indians from certain parts of the country. I mean, people were attacked. People were attacked, including elderly were attacked. And, Ying Chao Kao, who's one of the authors of the book, talks about how he came back from Taiwan where he was visiting family, or they were visiting family, and then, they were at home afraid to go out of the house. So when we chose distress, we were trying to be respectful of the fact that not all of us face these deep, distressing circumstances, and we didn't want to somehow give the impression that despite every bad thing that was happening to every one of us, it was qualitatively the same, because it wasn't. And to add one other quick line, this is really for me. I was talking to Anandi, a well-known Indian scholar, and Anandi has worked with workers, of marginalized communities in India. And she said that as they were talking to some of, the people that they were interviewing anyway about COVID, that many of the people said that, y'all are so upset about this. This is our regular lives. So COVID wasn't this huge thing that suddenly burst. And to me, it was such another telling moment of how, things that happen to us, look, here we were writing this book because it happened to us. And they rightly pointed out that our lives are always in a state of disruption. It's always in a state of distress. So, I mean, I could theorize about, layers and layers of suffering and trauma and so on. We just felt that, if we are really working on this book with integrity, that we should not make such generalized statements when so many people were involved who were not quite at the same level, even through all of our suffering. So I'll kind of stop there.
Thank you for those responses. So our next question is on autoethnography as a methodological tool. So when we talk about autoethnography, we know that it helps in capturing the self-focused experiences that reveal structural realities from different parts of the world. My question is, how does it do so? And this question is sort of to all our three speakers. How does autoethnography as a methodological tool help in capturing the self-focused experiences or realities, structural realities from different parts of the world? So if you could begin with you, Professor Purkayastha, and then.
Okay. So, we began with this focus on autoethnographies because we were really keen to capture what was going on. And we were stuck in our houses. In a way, the first starting point was not a choice. Like, we couldn't choose our other methods unless we were only going to do something like, we'll interview people, but that's a privilege, right? Who has access to the internet and so on, so we can do remote interviews and all of those things. So that's one part to keep in mind. But the other part is autoethnographies have, over the years at least, I'll just talk about the American part. It had begun to move more to the center stage. It kind of begins, at least the American version of begins earlier, comes through ethnography, comes through the fact that some of the people doing ethnographies were also drawing on their own experience. And then there's a whole stream of how is this a methodology? How is it different from anything else? All of these discussions happen. Okay, we knew about those. We know about the claims, at least I know in the US, about the claims to what are the roots of autoethnography. What we had in mind, and we actually learned a good lesson through this process, which, we can talk about later, but what we had in mind is we needed people to use themselves and reflect on what was happening, both the space and the time. I mean, typically, as sociologists, we don't pay as much attention to the time, but it was important to pay attention to the time as well as, the situation. But there had to be a kind of commitment towards theory. I don't mean write theory per se, but get beyond your story to what are the larger structural circumstances and what could be learned from that. Now, that was in many ways the motivation. But as we rightly found out, and as ethnographers find out regularly on the field, these words don't necessarily mean the same thing to everybody. So we had to come up and make a decision about, we might have started with autoethnography, not necessarily because we were going to hold people to a certain way of doing things, but, with a general idea of, for example, how much commitment to the structures as opposed to how much of commitment to what you were going through. And we very quickly decided that we were going to let that kind of run free. We were not going to draw that line really seriously. And as we reflected on it, it really made a lot of sense. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I will just, say that we were also, all of us, very much involved and committed to the whole idea of getting away from Western frameworks, decolonizing, if I want to use that word, but in a way I'm staying away from it. So even out here in, in North America, we are paying attention to indigenous scholars and so on. And they don't use the term autoethnography, and why should they? Very often it is about storytelling, because that is a far longer traditional lineage, but it captures structures. So we kept the term in the title of the book, but in practice, we opened it up because that's what we wanted to do. Be respectful of exactly how people were going to describe their experiences, and to what extent would they balance a description of their experiences with the larger structures within which their experiences were unfolding. So I think I'll kind of stop right there, but if you have other follow-up questions later on, we can, I can certainly talk about that. But maybe Melanie and even Maitrayee might have something to say about that.
I think you captured, our intentions and goals really well, Bandana. I think the important elements for us were really, thinking about the ways that personal experiences fit into the larger structural, societal impacts that people were, how people are being constrained, and that is so important for understanding the intersectional inequalities that COVID, brought on, and that those, that those were experienced very, very differently. And so autoethnography has sort of a tradition and, a methodological style that didn't necessarily fit well with all of our authors. And so, to be respectful, I completely agree that we thought it very important to allow their voices to provide direction, of course, to thinking about here's how we'd like to, here's how we'd like to see these stories unfold, but at the same time giving people the choice of how they wanted to tell their stories.
Right, and Professor Chaudhuri, I'd like to hear you as well. Yeah, I think your microphone is turned off.
Yeah, thank you so much, because I think both Melanie and Bandana put it so well to describe, the difficulty in a certain sense to capture diverse and unequal voices, whatever be our intent, to actually let that come through. And I think the volume has that. But autoethnography, I was curious, in fact, because I was ignorant, and maybe this is a forum can come out more openly and say, I didn't know this term. So one knew about the reflective turn, the self-reflexive, question, the awareness of the field, the question that who you study can talk back, question you. And there's a lot of writing, that whole turn which took place with the new anthropological turn. But autoethnography, I understood that a broader relationship between self and society, and many of the essays actually do bring in Mill's sociological imagination here, in many of the essays, I see that coming, the question of looking more carefully at yourself and how the self is constituted. And I sort of learned as I did it, and since Bandana mentioned the question of decoloniality, so for many of us who are literally here, in the sense both in terms of training and our work life, this has been a constant, like we hear new terms, and sometimes you're actually invited, like I was invited many decades ago as somebody who works on intersectionality, and I had to quickly Google and find out what was intersectionality, though I had been identified as somebody who does intersectional analysis. So it's a constant going back and finding out, and then finding out, okay, this is something I was doing, but I didn't have the language to articulate it, nor have maybe the confidence of academic privilege to give it a name. And there, I think the question of storytelling that Bandana tells is very interesting about indigenous people. But in our own parts of our country, the first intellectual modern articulation of the kind of dispossession, say, Dalit writers had was in fiction, was in poetry. Because that was the format they could express themselves in. And there was this sense of angst, which got played out differently, that why don't you do theory? Okay, and that was the angst for scholars from many axes of subalternity. So it could be the dispossessed, like the early generation of Dalit writers and fiction writers and poets, where you didn't have the language, linguistic and theoretical skill to present it in the format that others would expect you to present it. And that was my own experience with feminism, that you didn't have the language, say, oh, everybody says they're not feminist, so it must be something so there is no feminism. But whereas we didn't have the language of difference 20, 30 years ago, it was not acceptable to articulate it, So the fact that, the editors of this wonderful book took all that into cognizance and let people tell their stories that they wish to tell it so, or that the only way they can tell their stories. Because in a certain sense, even and I found that marvelous, the story you've talked about, Anandi's account, the kind that people who are right in the margins of precarity, where precarity is not just a word, that is how they live. If they go out to work, and when they come back, there could be a demolition of their tenements. There may be no homes that they've gone back to. So that sense, and if you ask them, who demolished, they would talk about actual social institutions, but not in the sociological language. It could be the state, it could be a private contractor. So they're basically talking about, market institutions or state institutions, but they wouldn't have the language to describe it. So I agree completely with what both Melanie and Bandana say, that these were people who know structures, and they will never talk about experiences, which is, very often the critique that you're just navel gazing, or you're obsessed with what yourself. Because I think precarity, that is the whole standpoint position. You see the structures in a way in which privileged people can't see the structures, And I think there's so much to learn from that. I think I've spoken more, but I was so struck by the way the two of you presented, why you chose the term and yet bracketed it, to allow people to speak and write the way they wish to. I was also wanted to ask Dipali and Rituparna, maybe you all would have heard this term. Because, you all are more connected with, autoethnography.
Honestly, I had also not heard it because probably we were not really familiar with it as a method, in the sense, because when you look at sociology and the practice of it, mostly ethnography is practiced outside your own homes and outside of what you do. So I hadn't come across the term, and the concept note that you had shared, it looked interesting because it had focus on a so-called new method at that time for me. Only much later did I found out that it actually has a much historical background.
Dipali?
Same with me. I think this was the first time, and my immediate reaction was to Google what autoethnography was. But I'd like to mention that, what I found a bit challenging was, because when I teach my students, I always tell them that you have to be objective about, the data. You can't be very subjective and bring in your views. But with autoethnography, what the case is that you're taking your own experiences and sharing them. So where to draw the line as to, what could actually be, data, or how valid that is or not, that was something that I sort of struggled with a little in using autoethnography as a method. So I just wanted to share that.
Can I add like a couple more sentences on that? And actually, you all just captured the fact that autoethnography, it's not a centrally recognized method, even here. So if somebody were to keep using autoethnography for a lot of their work, which I can imagine circumstances when they can do that, there'd surely be some institutional pushback saying, oh, all you can do is tell your own story. So that power thing also is in place. But as we were talking, something else popped into my mind, which I think is important. COVID generated avalanches of material. Everybody, there were special issues, there was this, there was that, there was something else. And I think in a way, by leaving the term autoethnography in the title, we have been able to signal what the focus of our collective work was. Because really, before the book was published, I know at least 3 special issues that were brought out, including by feminist scholars, which in some level, what people were documenting wasn't that far away from what some of us were documenting. But from that perspective, how we arrived at what we arrived, I think sending that signal was important. Even though, as I said, we were struggling to figure out how to do this in an ethical way, in a way that reflected our integrity and commitment to, we are not going to impose a Western method, without thought.
I think it's a very telling discussion on how autoethnography itself could be related to questions of histories of knowledge production and how we narrate our stories, particularly, of course, in the global North and global South. When we talk about academia, the book also says that it uses it as a node and shows how the pandemic intensified some of the transformations in higher education. So if we could talk about some of the themes, and Professor Chaudhuri, if we could begin with you, because the chapter does talk about it, the idea of technology as a solution, or the impact of technology and the all-pervasive digital spaces, or the very fact that we are always now at work and the transformation of public and private spaces.
Yeah, there's what is very interesting, and I think a lot of this book and your writings generally by sociologists during this period had focused on the point that the pandemic had intensified existing inequalities in society, and also in a certain sense, dramatically showcase some of the larger structures which were in play. So this whole buzz about technology was already there prior to the pandemic, Some of the discussions were already in place in the Indian context about, the resources spent on public universities, that we could probably shift to an online mode. I remember, even newspaper articles saying that teachers are dispensable. So that debate was already in place. The pandemic accelerated it. So just like we didn't know what autoethnography was, we didn't know what Zoom was or what a Google Meet was, right? But we learned it very quickly, and we sort of entered it. And I would still feel we wouldn't have had a platform like Doing Sociology had there been no technology of this kind. But the question is, and I think this is something which is very central to sociological theorizing, that technology is double-edged. There's nothing technology in the abstract. It arises in specific contexts and it is applied on specific contexts, and impacts different people differentially. And this is what we witnessed. And I think both Dipali and Rituparna would be able to tell more about what online teaching meant for us. I had not retired. I was still in the university. And I remember that firstly, we had this extraordinary administration. We didn't offer us any of the platforms. So it was entirely entrepreneurial selves at our best between students and us who decided to hold online teaching. There was nobody who actually facilitated this. And since many of the students, the university was shut down dramatically, quickly, abruptly. So students had gone to different parts of the country, many stranded halfway, and they didn't have access to online, teaching classrooms. So the students again recorded the lectures themselves and sent it to the students. So it was in hindsight, we thought it was an extraordinary kind of situation. Many people actually did drop out. They could not continue, So the question of technology being a solution works in specific contexts, because in the regime that we live in, it is something which is considered as helpful, because they can then monitor the point that Bandana was saying earlier. What are we teaching? Who are we teaching? What are we saying? So the surveillance system can also be operationalized, everywhere, And it is not just technology, because since I've moved out of the university and now live in places where, much of the middle class in Delhi lives, that people believe in it. There is an ideology of technology as solution. So anything, if there's a theft, if there's an assault, the first thing they will say, but where were the cameras? So even private apartments, they have their cameras, The sense that this is going to solve the criminal problem, sexual assault, all ills of society can be addressed by technology, And I think it's a dangerous ideology of technology as a solution, but it has run deep. But this is, again, like I said, not to gloss over the fact about its possibilities. But those possibilities are only possible given certain kind of freedom. Maybe in some of the essays of some of the scholars, even this would be difficult. We don't know. We know that there are parts where you would not have internet connection. If you do not have internet connection, we cannot have this conversation. Now, who controls that? So again, the issue of structure, individual experiences, but maybe, because you all are teaching Dipali and Rituparna in different parts, and I think one of you on online teaching, if you could bring in a little bit of that.
So as Professor Chaudhuri mentioned about JNU not giving us platforms, there were other universities and colleges in which classes were actually held on WhatsApp. So, so many of my colleagues, as well as me, when we were not teaching in Delhi University and in different places, we were made to send voice recordings on WhatsApp if this was an open university or a regional university. And that is how students actually function. She is also right in saying that probably we wouldn't even have Doing Sociology if there was no technology, because it was easier for us to do it with the help of technology. But at the same time, I also feel that it became an excuse for state and institutions to completely shrug off responsibility and say that, technology helps and it's easy to do, so why don't you do it? I'll also cite one example from the recent kind of changes that are happening with the new education policy. And they now expect teachers to do everything. So they say that, you should learn software skills, very basic IT skills on your own, because you were doing it in the pandemic. So why not now? And then, they want us to be trained. Faculty development programs orient us in doing that. Dipali and I also attended one. And then they expect us to do everything that probably the IT department was doing, in the hope that teachers can actually not just do the academic, but also the administrative stuff. And these are huge burdens, at the same time also completely blurring the boundaries between home and work. As it happened with me, I was for the whole day I was in college, then I came, there was a meeting, and then I came right to it. And I'm sure Dipali will have more to add from her own experiences as well.
Right. I think my experiences were quite similar to Rituparna's, because this was my first teaching experience was online actually. So, in fact, I taught a particular course entirely online without even having to visit the university or even meet my students. Even once. But as we were discussing it, sort of just struck me how, because our particular chapter talked about public universities and public university in India. Right now in the country, like elsewhere in the world, there is this whole industry called the edtech industry, the educational and technology industry. I think post-COVID and during that period, it has grown so much, so that now if we watch FIFA, there is an edtech company which is sponsored, the FIFA World Cup as well. So we do know that how this industry is growing, and in India particularly, now a lot of public universities are signing a lot of contracts with these companies to offer degrees online. So that is how education is changing. So I think that is quite striking. I mean, since we wrote that chapter, and now how the online mode has transformed education here. So teaching, of course, and the last point about how the divide between home and workspace has changed. For instance, all of us are attending meetings at very odd hours in the day, and you have to attend it because that is part of your job. So I think, those are things which we now experience post the pandemic, or I would say since the pandemic started, how the online and has changed our lives. So
I just want to come in a little bit here, because the book talks a lot about the issue of feminist caring, mentoring, solidarity. Now, I just was curious that in a structure which has become so mindlessly governed by technology, and also a lot of bureaucratic, banal doings which they expect teachers to do, how do we combine this with the kind of time and space that old-time academics like we had to mentor, to spend time, which is not directly linked to output, as they put it in contemporary language, Bandana or Melanie, I'd like to hear from you.
I was going to pick up on something, actually, all three of you touched on it, even before I get to the caring, and how much of the costs of these technological systems have been pushed to us. I mean, here I am doing Zoom from home. This is my internet. I had to pay for it, on my computer, which I paid for. And while I will be held liable for any infraction of university policy, the costs are still on me, which further exacerbates who can and who cannot. But it was also remarkable to me that Akosua Darkwah said that for their university in Ghana, the students did go home. Every student was actually given a SIM card by the university. The university paid for the SIM cards. I'm not sure that was true widely in many other countries. All the costs of whatever it was, including the WhatsApp you're talking about, was paid for by the people, right? And then to go back to the question of care, it's become very difficult because I've shut it down, but Microsoft regularly used to send me something saying, you said spend so much of your time on meetings, you answered emails this quickly and whatever. So there are systems counting. I've shut it down. I don't care. I'm senior, however that was going. But the fact is they still, kind of collecting that data on me, colonizing me. I mean, I'm the resource through which these data, the edtech industries, all the massive amounts of data they are collecting from us, it's for their profit, right? So the question of care then becomes, in this altered structure, a way of capturing what you're going to be doing from your heart to a certain extent. If you're really caring, that is your kindness, who you are, how you do it. And the structure right now is trying to fragment that in ways that it's quantifiable. So people can still say, look, care is happening, Because guess what? You met with these students for 5 minutes, and there is no thought to what happened in those 5 minutes or 5 hours or what have you. So it's somewhat like that McDonaldization of society
You
when
mentioned,
George came out, that you take what used to be quality and you break it down and you fragment it. And in a way, I think that transformation has just become normalized and legitimated through the pandemic. Because
absolutely.
you were still trying to do it, you cared, but it's like, how can you quantify that? Yeah.
And I would add to that, Bandana, that it's so gendered, right? That, we know, like, this is the beauty of using academia sort of as an example of the ways that, transformed our societies, right? Is that, in our academic departments, women disproportionately, people of color, non-binary people disproportionately carry the burden of all of these kinds of mentoring practices, the kinds of service that make universities run. Whereas, men say no, so often. And that is part of our commitment to feminist care, but it has consequences, right? And I think the pandemic also intensified that kind of divide that we heard of in so many of the stories that people told in the volume.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you mentioned the data about the publications by women academics, sharply declining during the pandemic, Yeah.
So to sort of take this conversation forward, Dr. Heath, you talked about the intersectional inequalities. Could you please provide a few instances of what it meant to people on the margins, discriminated by color, sexuality, or citizenship?
Yeah, well, so we had many stories that I think, covered a spectrum of the ways that these intersectionalities affected people's lives. I think one evocative example was the chapter by Maitrayee Chaudhuri, who, she, I think, captured the way that the pandemic in many ways closed in on her in a very interesting way. Because she was living in London, she had dual citizenship between Iran and the United States. But her partner is in Sweden, right? And so as the shutdown happened, she realized, that being isolated in London, where she had no family, no home, and how to define home, how to define who your sense of belonging is so connected to ideas around citizenship, right? So when she tried to leave to go to Sweden, this is where, her non-status as a citizen became so important, right? That she was questioned along every step of the way as to, where does she belong? In fact, one of the airline officials told her to just go home and sit out go home, sit out the pandemic. Well, she'd already given up her apartment. She had no home. Where was her home, right? So I think, thinking about the ways that citizenship, nationality, race, class, gender, sexuality, all of these work together to create, in her case, some privileges because she was able to book a flight in March of 2020 to leave London to go be somewhere where she could find her, she could find support. And at the same time, she was blocked at every step of the way because of, her Iranian, she's from Iran. What is she doing? She's American. Who is this person? Where is home? What does citizenship mean? So that's one example I thought was very evocative of some of these intersectionalities. We had another one, a student, Madison Bernloff, who, am I saying her name right? I don't know if I remember that correctly. But she also, was forced to work, as an essential worker. And she, again, being a student during COVID had a very different impact in terms of your placement in academia. And being, she had certain privileges, but at the same time, she was forced still to try to make ends meet, right? And trying, lost the jobs that would really helped her to survive, and so was forced to work in a grocery store, where she was constantly feeling at risk and feeling like she might get COVID. So I don't know, Bandana, did you have some other stories that you thought were very evocative?
I mean, that was one I was going to bring up, but I think quickly just mention two. One, all of the people who had parents in other countries and parents living on their own, which normally they always expect will go back, we can be there for need, and border shut down. So, except for a couple of people, I know there's a US examples. The border shut down and the immigration service was shut down by the order of then President Trump. So their visas were in jeopardy. They didn't know if they were legal or illegal because they were supposed to renew, but they couldn't renew. So that, those kinds of things happened. And then the other thing that stands out in my mind, at least two of the people who wrote for us had cancer. And so then you already have cancer or other severe diseases, and you're trying to navigate this thing of, I still need medical care when all of the hospitals are rapidly being transformed to COVID hospitals. So again, every one of the chapters has something to tell that, at least for me, it has given me pause to try and really understand the enormity of what was happening. So those are just a few of the examples I'm choosing.
I just wanted to bring in, because
yeah,
I just wanted to bring in Dinesh's story in our chapter, because she's not here, where his sense of literally being like dropped out of everything, and the sense of angst that I would sense, when I would try and call him, and it would be impossible to get the line, because here it's a question of class and caste and rural. That it's perhaps, as Bandana mentioned earlier, that it's difficult even to imagine the sense of complete sense of being not belonging anywhere. Like the universe, he was not sure whether he can ever come back to the university at all, and fortunately it has. But I am sure there would be many cases where that story didn't end happily.
And then, of course, there's also the story of Ying Chao Kao, who was moving between Taiwan and the United States, and the kinds of racism that he experienced. Talking about like this idea of go back to your country, and the Asian peril, and the way that about the Kung flu, and just the kinds of open racism that against Asians that really again accelerated hate crimes, and and the idea that masking all of a sudden became so politicized and something that was a marker of race, right, in the United States. So again, these kinds of intersectionalities are so important to the way that people experience the pandemic. I'll leave it there. I don't know, Bandana, if you have other thoughts.
No, I'll just add one line. It's my sense that the rising levels of violence of all kinds, including vigilante violence against groups, was just legitimated during that time. I mean, it's a stark example. I will not minimize it for a minute, but I can think of many other countries where particular minoritized groups were identified, blamed for spreading pandemic, and then a whole series of violence against those people online and physically just seemed to be, oh, well, they brought this great disaster. These are people, they're just emotionally, it doesn't mean anything. And it just became like a normal occurrence. It was okay to be violent. So violent publicly. I mean, it was always true privately, for what it's worth. But yeah.
And that continues. That continues.
That is the terrible part, that many of these, things have now become naturalized.
Yeah.
Yes.
And nobody thinks of it anymore.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the time. I don't know.
Last question. Yeah.
Okay.
So we know that the volume is very rich, and it would be, of course, next to impossible to summarize it. But we would like to end with the two of you talking a little bit about the theme of solidarity, because we did speak about care and mentoring and feminist pedagogy, academia. So if you could talk a little bit about it, and then we can end.
Shall I go first, or Melanie, you want to start? Okay, I'll start. So again, we mentioned these before, that for all four of us, we were and continue to be, this is just who we are, we continue to be centrally committed to respecting scholars from other parts of the world. And so for us, solidarity meant we had to figure out how to be respectful of what people were doing, what people were saying, and so on and so forth. If you read the introduction to the book, one of the ways in which we express this solidarity is very often, books with multiple authors, they have a introductory section and then a section on the chapters, and we did not do that. Every single author is woven into the introduction because we felt it's not just about us, it's all of us are talking together. So we made that happen. I kind of, looking back, feel a sense of accomplishment that we did do that. We didn't actually put that much of thought to it. We felt this was the right thing to do, but I somehow feel now that was done well. That is a model that I'm going to try and follow, because otherwise there's a segregation between here are the editors and here are the authors. That's not what this book is about. We all co-wrote it, and it's an expression of solidarity. I think the other thing that I would maybe highlight in terms of solidarity is we tried very hard to get people from various, positions in their positionalities in particular societies, but to the extent we could across the world. We couldn't accomplish it. We only have chapters from certain parts of the world. But, there we were somewhat also constrained by how many pages publishers will allow, and frankly, also our networks. There are lots of parts of the world where we would have liked, to get experiences, but one, it had to be written in English right away. There is we could say we are in solidarity with people whose primary language is not English, but as soon as we begin to write, we are still seeking things in English. So in ways, it is not as expensive as it could have been. On the other hand, I think we stayed kind of true to our values of we are in this together. And I think that, to me, is the central aspect of solidarity that I think is reflected in this book.
That is beautifully said, Bandana. And I just want to, I think for me, I want to also emphasize the personal ways that solidarity helped me deal with the pandemic. There was, for me, I was going through a period of grief. I was very isolated, and, the being able to, that kind of feminist solidarity that I had with my co-author, with the co-editors, with the authors, it was, it really meant a lot to me during that time. It still means a lot to me. It was, solidarity is so important in these kinds of endeavors as we work together to create something. And I think that was the beauty of this volume, is that all of us work together. We all, there was a sense of we're in this together. And so I will just end with that, just emphasizing the point that Bandana made.
And I want to turn that question back to the three of you as well. Was it true or not true, or how did you feel? I don't know. So
I think we primarily survived because of doing sociology and the solidarity that we had. And this project continues because the three of us probably have a similar kind of passion and also work commitment, and the way, even if someone is missing, the other two sort of cover. And the solidarity is just visible. Also, no hierarchy in place at all. Although this is a project both of us started with a supervisor, but it never felt like that we were her mentees or students. And also probably the zeal of learning, especially I have to mention ma'ams, because she was excited about every new thing and the way she was trying to learn. So I think, yeah, we primarily survived because of solidarity.
Yeah, and also, to have alternative values in place, that it is not cutting edge, it's not competitive, and you have to show that by living those values, right? That it's okay, if you're sort of not top of the rung. Right now, of course, I keep telling them it's okay if you don't have a job, because it's reached another level of crisis.
I want to thank Doing Sociology, though, because it has been fantastic to read what y'all are doing, and even for y'all to invite us to, talk about the book and so on, does mean a lot. And I also think that's, part of these. I mean, ultimately, it's about our relationships, right? And while y'all are doing all the work producing this wonderful stuff, I kind of feel like, oh yeah, it's part of me as well, because I read it and so on. So thank you for doing, everything that you're doing.
Thank you so much.
I would like to echo that. Thank you so much for inviting us. This has been such a wonderful conversation and is so appreciated. And also, I agree, building solidarity among all of us. So thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to all our three speakers today for joining us. We had the most wonderful discussion today. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you. And we'll be seeing each other soon. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.